How many have been here since the first day? Lots. Excellent. And for how many of you is it your first QuiltCon? Lots. Awesome. How many have been to every QuiltCon? No one. Anybody in Georgia last year? Okay. Anybody see our presentation yesterday? No one. How about my presentation in Georgia? No one. Good. Then they'll all be new quilts for you. Alrighty. I have my cheat sheet, so I have to read from them so that I don't forget to mention all the good stuff for you. My name is Patti Carey, and I'm Vice President of Public Relations for Northcott. We are one of the major fabric companies in the quilting industry. We are the makers of Colorworks cotton solids, and we have samples in the booth when you sign up for our monthly newsletter, which is information only, non-committal. We give you a fat quarter of our wonderful ultra black color from our Colorworks for you to try. If you have not tried Colorworks before, you're going to love it. Anybody a Colorworks user? Good, glad to see that. We are also sponsors of the applique and minimalist categories here at QuiltCon. I've been with Northcott for 32 years now. I started when I was 4. And and I've been a quilter for 25 of those years. I regularly speak to guilds all over North America and even around the world on all things Northcott, particularly the fabric design and printing process. I've been published in a number of quilting magazines, and in my spare time, I design and produce quilt patterns that are distributed by Quilt Woman. I've been a member of a traditional quilt guild for about 20 years now, and a modern quilt guild for the past 5 years. I joined my modern guild to help me and Northcott understand the modern quilting movement and help us to provide product that fits the needs of the modern quilter. And along the way, a funny thing happened. I discovered that I actually really enjoy modern quilting. So it's been a really cool journey for me. I say we're all somewhere on the learning curve, and so for modern quilting, I am still working my way along that learning curve, but I am enjoying every moment of it. Coming from a fairly traditional quilting background, I'm really exploring more and more that modern quilting has to offer. So allow me please to take you along with me today as I explore what is to me a cornerstone of modern quilting, and that is alternate gridwork. So I've got a few quilts, because I know quilters like to see quilts, so we've got a little trunk show. And so let's start off with the definition of alternate gridwork. The modern, how many of you are members of the Modern Quilt Guild, by the way? Anybody not a member? A few, okay. I joined last year so that I could do a little bit of research on alternate gridwork, because there are some fantastic resources on the Modern Quilt Guild website and these great webinars. So there was a great one that I watched, and so I encourage you, if you're not a member, I think it's really terrific value. So the Modern Quilt Guild defines alternate gridwork as a modern quilting design element that is frequently used by modern quilters and a tool to help showcase the modern quilting design principles of negative space, no borders, minimalism, asymmetry, exaggerated scale, and modern traditionalism, or the updating of classic quilt designs. But I thought, I'm still not sure what that means. So I dug a little bit further. I found the Free Spirit Quilt Guild in Pennsylvania. Anybody a member of that guild? Nope. Defines it as a layout that does not follow a traditional block format or grid structure of rows and columns. And digging further still, Jessica Scultity of the Quilty Habit blog defines it as arranging your quilt in an unconventional or unexpected manner. So now we have a little bit clearer picture of what it is that we're looking for. Let's take a look at how we can incorporate it into our modern quilts. The Modern Quilt Guild's blog was a great source of information, as I mentioned, and as was Quilty Habit blog. There was a page on Quilty Habit's blog where she actually lists her top 10 tips for incorporating alternate gridwork into your quilts. And it was a really great page, so I highly recommend that you visit that. Number one, we can play with scale in a variety of ways. We can enlarge a traditional block. We can combine large and small versions of the same block. So let's take a look at a couple quilts here. And this is called Revolution by Kat Tucker. And in this quilt, Kat has larger, medium, and smaller circles. And so she's really incorporating larger and smaller versions of the same block, those blocks being the circles. And just arranging them in a manner so that they are just floating on the background. And Jen's got a quilt here, this one, where the stars are randomly spaced and the various components, again, those circles, large and small, and they're randomly positioned on the background. So it gives, it's an asymmetrical layout, quite different than a traditional quilt would be. And the one that Christina has is, this is my Morse code, and I've got the same block, but it comes in varying widths, so I'm changing it up that way to create something that is not, it just changes you. It's not the same, they're different, and so it causes you to take a moment and really take a look at it. We can intentionally create negative space in the body of the quilt. And this does not necessarily have to be in the center of the quilt. Think off-center when you're doing this. Something that I learned early on in my quilting is that if you include a high contrast color in one area of your quilt, you may want to consider adding it in another area of your quilt as well, because it keeps the viewer's eye traveling around your quilt instead of making them just focus on the one area of your quilt. And the negative space can even be at the perimeter of the quilt. And Jen has an example of one of, this is a quilt top. I can fit way more quilt tops in my suitcase to show you ideas than I can quilts. So in this quilt here, I've put, all 4 borders are a different size. And by doing that, it just throws the quilt off balance a bit, so it gives it more tension and more energy. It's a pretty simple one there. Christina has a quilt called French Weave. The fabrics used in this one are fairly traditional, but the layout gives it a more modern look. So kind of a bit of a bargello, but I'm breaking it up with these large areas of background, and it gives me somewhere to play with the quilting. This was in Quilt Trends magazine several years ago. We can improvisationally piece the background in a planned way using either low volume fabrics, and I saw a great quilt in the Janome booth that had a low volume background, you know, on the piece quilt. This one is quite large. The girls are doing their best to keep that white fabric off the floor. Can you tell? So this quilt here, called Modern Mountains. I have used a variety of different fabrics in my background, so it creates more interest there, but I've filled the background with all of these different fabrics. It's not just one fabric, and it adds a lot of interest. This is also an example of large and small scale. So you can see the smaller triangles, but depending on, they form larger triangles as well, so it's creating that what we talked about just a moment ago. So Heather Grant calls this piecing technique paneling. You accomplish this by breaking the quilt into segments that can be easily sewn together to build the quilt. So with my big triangle quilt, they form horizontal rows, those upper and lower triangles that's sewn together into a row. The next point, we can leave one or more spaces in a grid layout open or empty by using solid or background blocks. And in this example here, this is Mod Squad, and I purposely left some of the triangles as the background fabric to create that tension in the quilt. This is using Banyan Batiks, the Shibori. This is a brand new line that is a division of Northcott, and these will be hitting the stores very shortly. A couple months from now, Christina, for the Shibori?
Stores in March.
In March, next month. And this one here is Cosmic Wave. It's a Bargello, but it's not your typical Bargello. I've left large sections of that Bargello empty. I've used the background fabric, and because of that, it's created a flow and a tension in the quilt. So simply fill in your background with some fabulous quilting. How to take a Bargello from very traditional to something that's modern. This is Cosmic Wave. By doing this, you cause some asymmetry in the quilt and it adds tension. This is Strippy Hexies. And again, I have purposely left some of those hexies as background to create some interest in the quilt. And the next one is Modern Gridwork. It's my UFO. Do any of you have UFOs? I really tried to get this done for today, but unfortunately I didn't get it quite finished. So it'll go back on my quilting frame when I get home. But so I've used the two different blocks here, but I've left a whole lot of that space empty to fill in with some quilting. And more quilting when I get home. Not quite sure about the feathers. They're okay?
Yeah.
You know, my go-to resource for quilting is Angela Walters. And she uses feathers all the time. So I figure if she uses feathers, I can use feathers too. And that collection is Chloe, which is in shops now. We can place all of our blocks at the top or bottom of the quilt. And this is kind of the extreme of the quilts that we just showed. So this quilt here, there are blocks on the bottom and there are blocks down the side. These parts here were actually a pre-printed panel by Northcott Colorworks Concepts, and some of these fabrics are available in Web Fabrics booth. She has some Colorworks Concepts. So this is Stargazer by Jane Spolar, and Christina's got the Latitude by Brambleberry Cottage. Again, the blocks are down the side. This is one panel. Let the fabric do the work. And a few piece blocks down the other side as well to keep your eye flowing. But notice when the designer did this, she did not put the same number of blocks down both sides. She purposely left some background there to add some tension and interest to the quilt. Don't you love the striped binding on there? We can cut a block in half and add a strip of fabric to the other half. Consider taking this step a step further by slashing a large piece block into sections, adding pieces of background or other fabric to each segment, and reassembling the pieces or segments into a much larger block. It's quite liberating to do this. This whole background was a panel, a Colorworks Concepts panel, and the designer slashed it and inserted these strips of solid color in there to create the interest in the quilt. This is by Sue Beavers of Trillium Ridge. Cool quilting? Yeah, she's quilted it with some of her embroidery stitches on her machine. And that pattern is called Blue Moon. We can surround our blocks with background strips or negative space, adding enough to sew the blocks together into columns or rows. Jackie Gehring calls this variable framing and describes this technique in detail in Chapter 5 of the book Essential Guide to Modern Quilt Making, published by Lucky Spool. Lucky Spool is just back there, and they have these. This is one of my favorite modern quilting books, The Essential Guide. There's an excellent tutorial also on this on the Sew Mama Sew website. By making the blocks that vary in size and setting them off center in a large negative space, we can create the impression that the blocks are floating and remove the impression that they're actually set in a grid. So this is my strips and bars, and these are fabrics from the Colorworks concepts. Even though they look like they're piece blocks, this is actually one fabric. But when I built this quilt, I added solid background onto it to create the effect that they're floating on there. Yeah, it changes it, totally. Yeah. The next couple of categories, I don't actually have quilts for this, oddly enough. We can make piece backings. All of the quilts that we have, we use Northcott fabric. So we have yards, we have bolts of fabric at our disposal. So we never piece our backings. So they're all made from one fabric. But piecing your backings is a great way to experiment with this alternate gridwork concept. You can make a great big, think of it as a one giant quilt block that is on the back of your quilt that's made with your various fabrics. It's a great way to experiment. Someone long ago passed a tip along to me. If you take all the fabrics that you've used in your quilt and use them on your quilt backing, if something happens to the front of your quilt and you need to replace a piece of the fabric, you have some fabric because it's on the back. And it has aged at the same rate as the rest of your quilt, so just in case. From Heather Grant's Alternate Gridwork post, she says we can use an atypical angle for our layout. And I need to explore this with a quilt that I work on again shortly. You take your quilt and then you trim part off. You have, let's say this is your quilt, and take it and cut it like this, and take the piece. So if I cut a section out of my quilt, does that make sense? And then take this piece and put it on this side, and take this piece and put it, you switch those. And what it does is it takes your whole quilt and lays it on point, but your quilt is still that rectangle shape. So I haven't explored that yet, but I promise I will. We can offset or misalign our grids. Shift some of the columns or rows up or down or sideways to offset the blocks. And now I've got some examples for this. This one is Up by Elaine Theriot, and it was in the October 2017 issue of McCall's Quilting. So Elaine has built her columns, vertical columns, and shifted the triangles to give the effect that they're unbalanced. She has used the Artisan Spirit shimmer fabric in here and Toscana, which is a suede texture, for her background. We have some shade cards of the shimmer in our booth, and I'll tell you, it has been the most popular fabric collection in our booth. It's amazing. I think metallic is very on trend right now. Christina has my tree line quilt. This is also made with the Banyan batiks. The collection included a pre-printed yardage of these trees. So selvage to selvage in these trees. They're printed sideways on the fabric. I incorporated those with a couple of pieced rows, columns of the tree blocks. But with those tree blocks, I have staggered them, and none of them are at the same height. So I'm adding some tension by purposefully doing that in my quilt. And this is part of the 2018 Christmas collection. I got to play with it a little earlier than you. The next quilt here is Pebbles. And this is one that I did for McCall's Quick Quilts a couple of years ago, and it was reused for another, trying to keep the white off the floor. There we go. Okay. This is the simplest block. It was actually made with a striped fabric. So my striped fabric had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different shades from light to dark. So I cut it into columns, then cut the columns in half. So I had 3.5 stripes in each column. Does that make sense? I cut left-facing triangles and right-facing triangles. Here are the left-facing triangles, and that's the right-facing triangle from each half column. So this quilt only has 2 fabrics, but when I set them, I purposely set them off point like that to create something that had a modern feel. And again, I referred to my Angela Walters quilting books, and I started doing those feathers, and soon the feathers took over, so I thought, this is supposed to be a modern quilt. So I quilted the horizontal lines. I've used the same fabric as the binding too. So this quilt really only has 2 fabrics, but I love how that binding really perks up that quilt. Alrighty. Their arms are falling off now. We can use the rule of 1/3, and this is often used by photographers. Have you heard of the rule of 1/3? It is a simplified version of the Fibonacci number, or the golden mean, and it's a number that appears in nature. You may have seen it in the spiral of a shell. That is a true Fibonacci. So the rule of 1/3 suggests that we divide our quilt into thirds and place the focus pieces along one of the division lines or at 2 of the 4 sweet spots created by the intersection of those division lines. And we've got a couple quilts to show that as well. This one is Zipline by Jean Boyd. So Jean has placed this part of the quilt in the left third of the quilt, and then the horizontal part in the bottom third of the quilt. And it adds that tension that we're looking for to create an interesting quilt. Again, this is the Colorworks Concepts. This is 1 fabric. It's pre-printed that way. So, you know how easy this quilt is. Super easy. And the quilt that Jen has is my Charmed. All that piecing is offset, and it's along that 1/3 line of the body of the quilt to create that tension and give some wonderful space for quilting. I did not quilt this. I wish I did. I love how it was quilted. So in fact, all of these methods described are, for including alternate gridwork, do just that. They create interest. There is an empty space where a block would normally be. They create tension. I was expecting to see some fabric, some print there, and it's not. So that's how they're creating the tension in the quilt. Why is it missing? And so because of that, they create energy. They throw the viewer off balance enough to cause them to stop and take another look at the quilt. As you are viewing the quilts in the show, see which ones capture your attention. Chances are they've used alternate gridwork in their quilt. So in closing, I encourage you to incorporate alternate gridwork into your next modern quilt. I would like to invite you to come to Northcott's booth. We've got a couple of really fun things for you. We are booth 616. As I mentioned, if you sign up for our monthly newsletter, you'll receive a fat quarter of our Colorworks. We also have a fun interactive social media thing. We have little goodies of our microchips, a brand new collection called Canvas, which is a texture. If you take a picture of your favorite part of our booth and you post it on social media, hashtag Northcott QuiltCon or Northcott Fabrics, we'll give you this little packet as well. And Jen and Christine are demonstrating the AccuCut Go and giving out free samples for that. And you can sign up to win the AccuCut Go. So have a wonderful day. Thank you.